I think we are live because I
I think
saw
so.
a countdown. So I will say this is the pernicious purveyor of preposterous pomposity here, the King of Connecticut, and I'm filling in for the Hannibal on this episode. I just found out I was filling in a few minutes ago, and we have an amazing guest here, and I will introduce her to you.
If you
She
know who she
is
is.
she is the widow of a legendary boxer and actor, Tommy Gun Morrison.
Right.
Uh, and well, this is Trisha, I believe, right?
Correct? Yes.
Awesome. Well, Trisha, it is my pleasure to welcome you here to Canada's Top Combat Sports Podcast, the Hannibal TV. And as everyone can see, I'm in my evening attire here, and I didn't know I was hosting this, but this is a nice new robe. And yeah, well, it's great to welcome you to the show. And let me start out by just asking you a little bit about yourself. Where did you grow up?
Well, actually, I grew up in England and a little bit in South America as well. And I came to the States, the United States, back in the 90s. And I was working in tourism and the hotel industry, and then stayed here ever since.
Awesome. Now, is that where you met Tommy?
I actually was in Las Vegas in 1996. I had an office there, and it was during the fight that he got kicked out, February 10th, 1996. And I didn't actually get to meet him in person then, but I got to hear all the buzz and the story about the cancellation of the fight that night and the HIV diagnosis that he was given. And I didn't actually get to meet Tommy until he came to Wichita, Kansas in 2009. And as I've said in many interviews, I didn't know whether to give him the best room in the hotel or the worst room, because he actually had ruined my tourism week that week in Vegas, taking up all the hotel rooms, and then suddenly everybody just leaving Vegas, and I couldn't bring any tourists in from the UK or Canada, actually. So when I met him, I wasn't very happy with him.
Wow. So you actually met him after the diagnosis?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I wasn't aware of
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. The diagnosis was in the alleged diagnosis now was in 1996 in Las Vegas, and I didn't meet him until 2009. But the Morrison name had always stuck in my head. And when I saw him on the rooming list to check into my hotel, I thought, no, it can't be the same guy. And it was. So I definitely told him what I thought of him when he checked in.
Yeah, it's wild because I'm a big believer that your medical information here in the United States should be kept private. In my shoot life, I work for a major law firm. I'm with Berman Law Group down
Right.
here in Florida. So anybody listening who's been involved in an accident anywhere in all 50 states, if you've been injured in an accident, you can message me on my Facebook, Matthew J. GRANAHAN. But also with regards to privacy, in America, we have HIPAA, and I get on people, friends and students that I've coached in fighting and wrestling
Right.
about sharing their private information.
Yeah.
You should people are going to use that against you. So in the
Right.
case of Tommy, can you explain, like, how did that information get leaked to the public?
Right, yeah. So you're an attorney. That's good. So you might understand a lot of what I've been through, although you probably don't know about what I've been through. When Tommy passed away, I had a post-mortem examination done on him, and he died September 1, 2013. And on September 2nd, the media went crazy. They said, oh, you know, Tommy Morrison got diagnosed with HIV in 1996 and has died of AIDS in 2013. And I'm sitting there thinking, wait a minute, you know, we've just done an antemortem at Boston, Massachusetts General Hospital. They found no HIV, no AIDS. We've just done all the AIDS defining diseases. All the test results came back negative. And now I'm waiting for a post-mortem report to come back, and the media have already gone crazy. There is no privacy law out here in the US, apparently. So Tommy died September 1, 2013, September 17th, 2013. I am faxed Tommy's post-mortem report. The post-mortem report says no HIV. And it says it in scientific terms. HIV in scientific terms is a retrovirus. No retroviral particles, no viral particles seen, no abnormalities, no budding retroviruses. This is all on the postmortem. So I'm sitting on this and I'm going, wait, you know, stop. There is a postmortem and I need to get the truth out. So I then contacted Vegas. And I contacted the doctor there, Dr. Robert Boy, and I actually said, you better have good medical malpractice because they just did a post-mortem and there's no HIV. And he didn't die of AIDS. He didn't have any of the AIDS-defining diseases. And everybody's saying that he died of AIDS. And so Dr. Boy comes back to me through his attorney. And you know what it's like when you're an attorney, you know, you're representing your client. Okay, and I'm going to read it verbatim because this has been an 9.5 year lawsuit that I filed in federal district court in Nevada, went to the appellate court, went to the US Supreme Court, found new evidence, went back again to the federal court in Nevada, went back again to the US Supreme Court, and went back again to the US Supreme Court, perhaps for the last time, who knows. But this, I'm going to read it because everything I'm going to quote you is in court documents, right? And these are filed under oath. So, you know, you look at a court record as opposed to a so-called ESPN 30 for 30 documentary out there that's giving a different story. I'm giving the true story of everything that's happened and everything that's been exposed. So the Las Vegas Council for Dr. Robert Boy says, it is important for you to understand that Dr. Boy did not diagnose and never has diagnosed Mr. Morrison as HIV positive. And this is Counsel Mortensen for Dr. Boy. It's in docket 283. It's on page 28. It's line 14 to 15. This is coming from the physician in Vegas that was there in 1996. So I carry on. I do some more investigation. During the lawsuit, Dr. Henry Soloway, and I am going to name names, right? I am going to say who said what.
Yes, do it.
The CEO of the lab, that's Quest Diagnostics, and I don't know if you've ever dealt with Quest Diagnostics. If you need to recuse yourself right now from the show, please let me know. But
no, you know, let me tell you, you know, I'm far more on the personal injury side. With slip and fall and car accidents, but I can tell the viewers that Quest Diagnostics they're really the preeminent company when it comes to tests such as this. Yeah.
So I didn't know that. I'm just a regular person, right? I'm not an attorney. You know, I studied paralegal. Yeah. So to file this lawsuit was another podcast story. So the 1996 CEO of Quest Labs, Dr. Henry Soloway, files an affidavit it's in court records, I conclude that Mr. Morrison was never infected with HIV virus. That is in docket 136, page 9, and lines 27 to 28. So there is another story, and what I'm bringing is a true story. Then, during the court case, docket 174, and it was filed on the 8th of June 2016, page number 7. So even ESPN had access to this document. They had access to all these documents before they brought out their defamatory documentary. Here it says, plaintiff, which is me, now recognizes that neither the state defendants, and that would be Margaret Goodman, who runs VADA, Mark Ratner, who used to be the executive commissioner, and the Nevada State Athletic. Those were the state defendants. So plaintiff now recognizes that neither the state defendants nor Quest Diagnostics ever diagnosed Mr. Morrison as carrying the HIV virus. And that is court record 174, page 7, filed back in 2016. So that is just more proof. Then on docket number 140, you've got Bob Bennett, who's in charge of the Nevada Athletic Commission, and he files, Morrison was not indefinitely suspended on February 10th, 1996. And that is docket 140. So we know the whole world heard that Tommy Morrison was diagnosed with HIV on February 10th, 1996, and kicked out of boxing on February 10th, 1996. So that's part of the story right there. And I've got to get that out there because there is more. I have to read what one of Tommy's fans wrote, which basically puts it all in a nutshell. Everyone involved in the HIV diagnosis now denies ever giving the diagnosis and denies that they suspended him from boxing. His widow at the time of death has fought tirelessly for a decade to prove he never had HIV and backs it up with a mountain of evidence, including post-mortem tissue samples that show no trace of HIV/AIDS. And he goes on to say, please check out the facts for yourself and don't just believe the false narrative that has been circulating as truth for decades. Rest in peace, Tommy. That's one thing Tommy wanted, was the truth to be out there. You know, he did not know that the suspension in 1996 was lifted in 2006. Did you know that?
No, I didn't know that at all. And let me tell you, it's so interesting listening to this because all I know is what was reported from the news.
Right.
And,
yeah.
You know, as I said, it's my feeling that it's really none of anyone's business what someone is afflicted with. That's private information. But it seems in this case, it was a fraud that was perpetuated by the mainstream media for so many years.
Yeah.
And I've got to ask you this. Let's go back in time, okay? Because there was so much information you've read there.
Yeah.
To 1996. It's post the Rocky V, which we had which was a great role.
Right.
When you met him at the time when that was being reported, when you met him, he must have been livid that this information was out there. Did he attempt at that time to get on any sports media broadcasts? I mean, it's not like it is now where we have all these podcasts like Canada's Top Combat Sports Podcast. But we go back to the mid 90s. It was a totally different world, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we had just controlled media, right?
Right.
But did he try to get his story out there at that time with you?
He tried. You know what? You've got to remember, he was 26 years old, right? He had just been told that he was going to die before he got to the car, right? He was told, if you look, have you ever seen ESPN 30 for 30? Did you see the documentary that they did?
No, and Trisha, I'll tell you, Hannibal just asked me to do this interview
Yeah,
just prior to it, so it was kind of a last minute thing,
right.
and I would have done some due diligence and research on that.
Yeah,
I can tell you this, Trisha, I do remember seeing bits and pieces of it,
yeah,
maybe years ago, but I can't
yeah,
tell you. It's a vague recollection.
yeah. Well, it's there's not a good word for it. They show two scenes in that documentary. One where somebody is telling Tommy he has HIV,
Now, who is this
and
person? Stop. Who is this person that's telling him that?
okay, his name is Tony Holden, and he is telling Tommy that he has HIV. And there's no way of sugarcoating it, he says on this documentary, but you have HIV. That, first of all, for somebody who's not a physician, to tell somebody else that they basically have this disease that
Trisha,
is
Trisha, I have to interject. Who was this guy? He wasn't a physician.
right. He and Tony wasn't licensed for the fight either. He had a separate contract with Don King. Tommy had just signed a 3-fight contract with Don King, and this was the first fight of the 3 fights. Then there was going to be another one, and then he was going to be fighting Mike Tyson, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the whole thing is just very strange. But Tony Holden was an ex-promoter. He'd never had a signed contract with Tommy. He was an ex-promoter, but he did have his own contract with Don King. And he says in the documentary openly, so I'm not quoting anything that's not there, he says openly that he met Mark Ratner by the ring, and Mark Ratner told Tony Holden that Tommy had HIV and that he was to go and tell him, and that the fight was canceled, right? So first of all, Mark Ratner is not a physician. Tony Holden is not a physician. So, you with your privacy thing, privacy rules,
Sure.
and HIPAA. Well, first of all, February 1996, the HIPAA law hadn't come out yet. That was
Yeah,
in
that's
June.
right.
Okay. Yep. So, the commission has said, well, he signed this and this to say that, if he has anything, we're allowed to tell the public. Well, all the statutes that they're quoting me throughout this 8.5, 9-year lawsuit, I come to find out by contacting the legislator, weren't even in existence in 1996. So they had been using laws that weren't in existence. They were using them retroactive to a situation in 1996, which is beside the whole point, right? But
Sure.
during the lawsuit, I ask, it's called a request for admission, as you're very familiar with, but for others, you're basically asking the defendants questions and they have to answer them. And again, it's court records. Request for admission number 39. Admit you told the media you tested him and found him positive for HIV, and Morrison tested positive for HIV. And Mark Ratner replies, deny. He didn't do that. He says he didn't do that. But all over ESPN, in their espn.go.com, it says, since February 10th, when the Nevada Athletic Commission said Morrison tested positive for HIV before a fight, the 44-year-old has spent most of his days dodging the diagnosis. Well, wait a minute. I've got a court record here saying that there was no diagnosis. And I've also got a court record here, request for admission, saying that they denied ever even saying that. And that's now public knowledge. Anybody can pull that up. So it's something that I have been working on for 8.5, 9 years. Also, for the media,
I can hear it in your voice, Trisha. The strain and the stress, and I want you to get back to that. But I want to take the viewers back because you may have some younger viewers here,
Yeah.
and they may not understand this.
Yeah.
In the 1990s, beginning really in the 1980s with Rock Hudson, HIV was a death sentence.
Yeah.
It wasn't what it is now. It's really it's something now that is not even fatal. I mean, people live normal lives and they take medications for it. But back then it was a death sentence, and there was such a stigma that was associated with it. And you remember Magic Johnson, right? And some of the fans might be too young to even remember that. Was supposedly diagnosed with it, and he's still alive and healthy now. But there was what do you think was the impetus? What was the conspiracy, if any, behind this in promoting this false information, Trisha?
That's hard to figure out because this is still kind of ongoing. There's a few things. First of all, Quest Diagnostics, and I recently found that out when we were in the US Supreme Court a few months ago. The tests that they were using, $25 tests, were not FDA approved. They were what's called LDTs, laboratory developed tests, which have no clinical support to them to show their efficacy, that they actually do diagnose or detect what they say that they detect. So first of all, there's that, the testing. The testing throughout also was not FDA approved. One of the other tests was a PCR test. So as much as people say, well, why didn't he get tested again? Well, he did. He kept on getting tested. And it was, well, what test was it? Was it something that detected HIV, or was it something that detected antibodies to autoimmune disorders? Because that's exactly what he did have, so-called false positive. You can test positive on a test, but not have what they say you've got. You could be triggering a false positive. So people will say, okay, so what about the test in Vegas? Did he not have it twice? He did, but it was the same test, not FDA approved. Well, what about the test in Tulsa when he comes out with this big press conference and says, I have just been told I've tested positive for the virus? Well, in 1996, that test did not detect the virus anyway. So scientifically, he should not have said that he tested positive for the virus because there was no virus test. Also, the defendants could not provide a test to match up with that press conference. And then New York, there's also another media, again, ESPN, right, where they show Tommy's blood being taken and flown to New York. Well, they can't find the results for that. So, it's just another very strange situation.
Yeah, Trisha, ESPN is a very agenda driven network in many regards. Yeah. And we can kind of leave it at that. They're very agenda driven. Right. And I've got to get caught up. When did this 30 for 30 come out that you're referencing?
Well, 30 for 30 came out in September of 2017, and a lot of these court records were available prior to that date.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so they were pushing that agenda along, and you filed suit at that time in 2017.
I filed suit actually on the 24th of July, 2014, within the statute of limitations. Tommy died September 1, 2013. I filed suit on the 24th of July, 2014, and the judge closed it really quickly in 2016.
But wait, Trisha, I want to clarify because I was under the impression, I may have misunderstood, that you were suing the ESPN versus 30 for 30.
No, No,
Okay.
the actual defendants were Nevada State Athletic Commission,
Okay. Okay. Good.
Margaret Goodman, Mark Bratner, but they've all confessed in court records that they never diagnosed him with HIV. So right now, the only narrative out there, false narrative out there, is the ESPN story that has to be taken down.
Okay. Yeah. So to clarify that, and I'm sorry that you had to go through this. You learn firsthand how misinformed and how vicious the media could be, and I'm
Yeah,
glad that you were able to come here on this platform and
right.
discuss it. But what I'd like to do is I'd like you to talk about Tommy Morrison, the person, a little bit. Kind of give
Right.
you the floor to tell people what kind of a guy he was. We know he was a great actor and an outstanding boxer.
Yeah, yeah. He was just such a great guy, and he had a great career. 290 amateur fights he had. He had 50 Toughman contests that he fought underage, right? And
Yep.
51 professional fights. And he was kicked out of boxing at the age of 26, right?
Wow. Yeah. What a career.
Which is heartbreaking. Given a deadly diagnosis, he obviously went through very dark years. He wrote his own little booklet called My Darkest Years, where he does do drugs. And he's very open about that. And he says, I had to fill a void.
Sure.
I've just had everything taken. I have to fill a void. And he didn't like to watch boxing or anything. But he carried on working out in the gym. When I met him, it was probably the most sober time of his life. First of all, I had never watched Rocky V, so I didn't even know about Tommy Gunn, and I wasn't into boxing. I was a tennis player, so he almost liked the fact that I knew nothing about him, right? And it was
Mm-hmm.
like a fresh start for him.
Sure.
So,
Sure.
um, so he was able to be himself, and he just wanted to be normal. He took out the garbage, he fed the dogs, he took the dogs to the groomer. He just wanted to be a normal person, but always at the back of his head is this HIV stigma, right?
Oh,
You
yeah.
know, people
The
are talking.
Scarlet Letter, right? It was like the Scarlet Letter. It was
Yeah,
awful. And I
yeah,
always say this to people, mention about privacy, but I always tell people, don't tell people more than they need to know about your life and in general and anything, because
right.
people tend to try to use information against you, and this was got to take people back to that time, because it was a much different time
Yeah,
than it is now. And
that's right. Well,
what were his
you have to imagine, we've all been through this COVID thing, right, for the last 2, 3 years, where you can't touch anybody. You have to be 6 foot away,
Yeah,
don't
I
sneeze,
kind of
don't,
gotta say I'm in Florida, so we haven't really experienced
right,
a lot of the craziness that's other places
right.
have.
But it's the same thing. It was the same thing for him where people did not want to come close to him, didn't
All
want
right.
to touch him, didn't want to breathe the same air as him, didn't want him to sneeze or anything. When we walked through airports, he said, okay, Trisha, he said, just wait and see. There'll be people looking at me thinking that I already died, right? And I said, what?
Oh yeah.
And and there were. I mean, his whole life had been put out there, and now I am trying to repair that. That was one of the things that, in the back of his mind was always, how can I be alive when I feel so good? And how did this happen? And are the tests right? Why did the commission cancel my fight? If I did have HIV, why didn't they accommodate the fight in some other way? He was always thinking stuff. He was always
Magic
researching
Magic
stuff.
Johnson went back to playing basketball, if you remember. I don't believe he ever had it. He ever had it either. But I think that was another agenda they were driving. But he went back and played basketball. Now, am I wrong, or didn't Tommy Morrison box in West Virginia at one point? Didn't he have a comeback for a couple of fights in West Virginia?
Yeah, he had a fight in West Virginia. You have to remember that some of the states didn't require HIV testing anyway. You know, if you go back and you read Fauci, I mean, at the time, Tommy knew Fauci, Fauci knew Tommy, right? Now everybody knows the name Dr. Anthony Fauci, right? Even Anthony Fauci wrote back on February 12th, 1996, you can't catch HIV in the boxing ring, he wrote, right? So there weren't a lot of commissions that actually had HIV testing.
No, they don't. I mean, I've dealt with fight commissions with MMA, and a lot of them don't. I'm not currently, but years ago, I never read that a lot of them didn't. But you got to remember too, and I'll go back being older to when this was probably before that time frame. It's when the Rock Hudson thing came out, and I was still scholastically in school. I was in middle school or early high school or whatever. And I remember we were discussing, nobody knew how you could catch this thing. And people were thinking that you could catch it from, like, if I had put my book down and I had it and someone went and grabbed my book and touched it. So people have to understand what a crazy world it was, you know, in the lack of information back then.
Right, that's right. You know, there's something also in the lawsuit where, you know, I've included Anthony Fauci said back in 1984, if you've got two things, PCP and KS, PCP being pneumocystis carinii and KS being Kaposi sarcoma, you have AIDS, right? So we even had Tommy tested for those two things back in 2012 and totally negative. So he never had the virus. You know, and you say that a lot of people don't actually test for it. Well, in order to include that in the licensing, you had to have that with the legislator. You had to have that passed. And it's called the Administrative Procedures Act.
So Trisha, let me ask you then, why did he box in more states like he did in West Virginia? If that wasn't an issue, not that he had it, but that could have potentially been an issue because of all the misinformation. Why didn't he then box in more states and maybe even outside of the country, down in Mexico?
Well, he did. Okay. He fought down in Mexico, and then he fought in West Virginia, and then I think it was Wyoming as well. So he had three other fights. But he had taken, obviously, he had been suspended indefinitely worldwide. But you also have to think, who is going to want to fight somebody that the world has said has got this deadly disease? It wasn't easy to find an opponent, right?
Yeah, of course.
And when you found an opponent, the commission would say, no, we're not going to sanction this fight, even though, for example, like West Virginia, they did not have a rule to do HIV testing, even though he did it. So they followed him like he was in his own bubble. They followed him around from commission state to state. He had an offer to fight in New Zealand. He had an offer to fight in Australia. He had an offer to fight in Kansas. But everywhere, everyone is saying, no, well, you're suspended. You have HIV since 1996, and you don't get rid of HIV. There's one particular interview with Dr. Margaret Goodman, who runs VADA, the Voluntary Anti-Doping Association, which has been in the news recently, and she hounded him. In 2007, she came out with this media outlet saying, you know, upon my request, I asked Dr. John Hyatt from Quest Diagnostics to retrieve Tommy Morrison's results, and Dr. Hyatt is a physician and well-known pathologist, right? And he said they were unequivocally positive. Well, in this lawsuit, Dr. Hyatt was not a physician and he was not a pathologist. So she lied to the media, and she got caught in this lawsuit. And then there's another request for admission, number 29, where I target Dr. Margaret Goodman because she had hounded Tommy so much for him trying to do a comeback. Like you said, why didn't he fight, right? Well, if you come out with the media and you have somebody like Dr. Margaret Goodman, who has a huge status in the boxing world, I write, admit you can provide a document that confirms the diagnosis of the virus HIV in Tommy's blood on February 10th, 1996. And she responds, deny. She couldn't. She could not provide anything. So the history of HIV, the history dates back to 1996, right? Well, now, after 8.5, 9 years of judicial, journey, there is no longer a history of HIV dating back to 1996 because nobody has diagnosed him and nobody kicked him out. So I have to get the truth out for Tommy. That was kind of like a deathbed promise to find out what happened, right?
Yeah, it's so unfortunate that he passed away knowing that that mission hadn't been completed. And I want to kind of pivot before we close this out, just to ask you a couple of questions regarding some folks that Tommy had interaction with, and what were his impressions of Don King?
Well, everybody knows what Don King is like, right? So you take that risk as a boxer when you go into a contract with him. The actual FBI, Tommy did end up in jail in 2000, and he writes this in his book, My Darkest Years. The FBI did come and visit Tommy in jail, and they said, we can get you out early if you can give us information on Don King. And Tommy said, I have no information. When I get out of jail for this GUI or whatever, I hope to contact him and get him to sign me up again, right?
Yeah. I mean, Don King is got a shady past for sure. What about Sylvester Stallone?
Yeah. Sly, well, I don't think I've received a phone call of condolences from Sly. I hate to say that. I think he's been pretty busy. And Rocky V was always something that was, as Tommy would say, was the red-headed stepchild of the Rocky movies, right? But as people watch it, they are, it's affectionate now, the Rocky V movie.
I ask you about Don King because in Rocky V, there's the character that's very very similar to a Don King. And if folks go back and watch that movie now in 2022 and the racial stuff, Rocky being the Italian boxer, and then they got the Great White Hope, and it was a hell of a movie. I think it was that scene where, I mean, Tommy's character, where he kind of turns away from and on Rocky, it's a pretty gripping story, and really, to me, I think it's one of the better of the Rocky movies. And like you said, it may be the stepchild, but I think the plot line, because let's face it, like Rocky IV, not a lot of plot twists. You got the heel with Ivan Drago, go back to Rocky III, Mr. T and Hulk Hogan, and Mr. T is Clubber Lang. I mean, that's so, there's not a lot of complexity to the characters. And then 2 and 1, essentially the same. I would argue that Rocky V and Tommy's role in that was the most complex up to that point. of
Right.
the plot lines, because I know I was good friends with the late Gene LaBelle, the godfather of grappling, who knew Sly really well, legendary stuntman, and
Right.
did acting in Hollywood. And he told me, he says, Sylvester Stallone's one of those guys that he just plays himself all the time.
Yeah. And Tommy was
In the
playing.
Rocky movies. Yeah.
Right. And Tommy was playing himself in Rocky Five. And I've only ever watched it once, and I watched it about 4 years after Tommy had died. So Tommy would always look at me, and he would say, "Oh, you remember that scene in Rocky Five?" And I go, "Look, I've never watched it." And he would start laughing because he thought that was pretty cool. But
He
no,
was a
with
great actor. He was a great actor. And I got to ask you, Trisha, did he have any other acting roles uh, after that movie? Because he was great in that.
He wanted to get into acting a lot more. He was contacted by John Gotti Jr. Back in 2011 to
Yeah.
be in, to be in the movie.
I'm laughing for another reason, Trisha, because
Oh,
one of the more popular videos on this channel, the Hannibal TV, is a press conference I did with Johnny Alite from the Gambino family, who is, I've got a lot of history with those guys, who is calling out Gotti Jr. to box, was
oh yeah,
from last year. And Phil Baroni, the New York badass, who's I managed for years,
right.
was enforcer for the Gambinos, and his father was a Gold Star detective that famously turned on those guys in the Gotti Jr. trial. So I have a lot of history when you mention Gotti Jr. That's kind of funny.
Yeah, Gotti Jr., he called Tommy one day and he told him basically, I want you in the movie that I'm putting together in the shadow of my father, right?
Yeah.
And
Oh
so
yeah.
they were talking, and John Gotti Jr. said to Tommy, he said, "Stop getting into trouble. I want you in my movie, but you've got to stop getting into trouble." And he talked about, how much his whole family loved Tommy, and they thought he was great. Now, when Tommy, I can talk for hours with you about, all the stuff that happened to Tommy in the years we were together. But there was one particular scene where Tommy, in real life, is in jail in Tennessee. And I have John Gotti Jr. calling me and emailing me saying that he's going to try and get him out. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, it's,
Yeah. I know John, and I know his sister Victoria pretty well.
yeah, yeah.
Too. Yeah. That. So that never happened though. That role.
That never happened. I think there were some changes anyway to the movie. John Travolta, I think, was still going to be in it and stayed in
Yeah.
it, but they made some other changes. Yeah. So it never happened. But Tommy was really excited for it. And his plan was to get into more movies. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I want to encourage the listeners to all go back and watch Rocky Five. I'm going to go back
Yeah.
and watch it, and that's kind of a great way for us to kind of segue out of this, because it's a positive memory of your late husband. And I just want to tell you, you've been a spectacular guest here, and I'm really sorry for your loss and sorry
Yeah.
for everything that you've gone through. And I want to wish you the absolute best of luck with your case. And anything you want to give a shout out as far as where people can follow you or anything that you're doing?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter, I'm on Instagram, and I'm on Facebook. One thing that Tommy did say was back in 2011, I fought for my fans, would they fight for me? And so, the only way I can get the truth out, the true story about Tommy for Tommy, is through the fans, because the media are vicious. They won't print something now that contradicts what they printed back in 1996. It's going to take time to repair everything that happened to Tommy. But you're welcome to look at court records and see my posts. I'm very open with it. And please share. Please share the true
What's
story.
your Twitter handle, Trisha?
Best to go, you'll see it on Trisha, Tommy, Morrison, or you'll see another version, Tommy, Trisha Morrison. So it's both that. It has both our names, Tommy, Trisha Morrison, on the Facebook and on the Instagram and on Twitter.